A small beggar saved a millionaire who was crossing the street without paying attention, giving her life in his place. When the girl whispered her last wish, the millionaire broke down in tears. Little Ivy, a child in tattered and dirty clothes, trembled as she crossed the glass doors of the restaurant. Her feet dragged slowly and her thin hands clutched her hunger-aching stomach. Her tired face bore the look of someone who hadn't known a meal in days. The restaurant buzzed with people talking and eating carelessly, oblivious to the girl trying to remain invisible. Each averted gaze and each disapproving grimace at her old clothes and frail body struck like silent blows. "Please, can someone pay for a plate of food for me? I'm very hungry. I'm feeling weak. Can someone at least give me a spoonful of food?" she whispered, her voice weakened by hunger as she gathered the strength to ask. The restaurant owner saw her and, without a shred of compassion, marched towards her with firm, heavy steps. He was a tall, stern man, his face displaying nothing but impatience. When he reached her, he raised his voice, speaking bluntly. "This is no place for you. Do you think the customers want to look at that while they eat?" he said, pointing at her as if she were nothing more than an unsightly object. Ivy lowered her head, feeling his words pierce her like knives, but she tried to respond with a weak, almost pleading voice. I just wanted something to eat." The man raised his hand, cutting her off abruptly. "Look here. Nobody owes you anything. Get out before I drag you out the door. Understood?" Ivy shrugged her shoulders and took a few steps back, her eyes burning with shame and hunger. As she backed away, she felt the weight of the gazes around her. Some people laughed discreetly, others raised their cell phones, while others looked away, uncomfortable with her presence. She felt even smaller, like a human rag in the midst of all that abundance. Above all, she felt weak from hunger. She glanced around, but no one showed the slightest intention of helping. Her face burned, but she wouldn't give in. She wouldn't let them see her pain. They can't even imagine what it's like to be hungry, she thought, trying to hold back her tears and keep her head up. As Ivy tried to find a less visible corner, an elegant waitress crossed the room, carrying a hot bowl of soup in her hands. The smell of food was irresistible, and Ivy's stomach growled loudly, making her feel even hungrier. The waitress looked her up and down with eyes full of disdain and slowly approached, as though Ivy were a stain on the floor she wanted to avoid stepping on. Without a shred of remorse, she gave Ivy a slight nudge with her foot, causing her to stumble in a calculated, cruel gesture. The waitress bumped into Ivy, spilling all the soup over the girl, who froze as the hot liquid soaked through her dirty clothes and onto her thin skin. The soup burned, but the sting of humiliation was even greater. "How clumsy of me," the waitress murmured with a smile, showing no remorse as she walked away. Muffled laughter echoed around the room, and Ivy tried to swallow her tears. Sorry. I just wanted a little food," she murmured, lowering her head in shame. The floor around her was splattered with the remnants of the spilled soup, small pieces of vegetables scattered across the tiles. Unable to bear the thought of wasting even a bite, she fell to her knees, her trembling fingers trying to gather what little she could. The customers watched her with varying expressions, some with curiosity, others with contempt, and many still holding their cell phones up, capturing every painful second. As she reached for a small piece of potato that slipped from her fingers, someone chuckled. "Look at that! What a spectacle! Someone should charge for this!" Laughter rippled through the crowd, but Ivy pressed her lips together, swallowing her pride. "I just wanted a little food. That's all," she thought, feeling her cheeks burn with shame. The cold, hard floor bruised her knees, yet she continued to pick up each tiny piece, her fingers shaking as she tried to save what she could. Her tears fell, mingling with the spilled soup as she muttered to herself, Nobody knows what I go through." Nearby, a young child watched Ivy with wide, curious eyes. "Mommy, why is she crying?" the child asked, her voice innocent and unguarded. Her mother quickly turned her daughter away, replying curtly, "Don't look at that, dear. It's not our problem." Ivy's chest tightened, as though the last shred of her dignity was crushed under that look of disdain. "I just wanted to be like them. Just for one day, one single day," she thought, her vision blurred by tears. As she tried to collect herself, the waitress returned, this time holding a broom. She began sweeping around Ivy with barely concealed disdain, brushing away the remnants of the spilled soup with brisk, careless strokes. "You're still here? I already told you, nobody wants you here," the waitress sneered. "This is a luxury restaurant, not a place for dirty people and beggars like you." Ivy tried to stand, but her legs wobbled beneath her, and her body felt as though it no longer had the strength to obey. "Sorry, I'm leaving now," she murmured, her voice barely audible, as she clung to the last remnants of her dignity. As Ivy staggered toward the restaurant door, the customers' laughter and cruel comments followed her like a haunting shadow. "Now that's entertainment. Should have charged admission," a man scoffed, igniting fresh laughter from those around him. Ivy lowered her head, holding back her tears as she mumbled something no one could hear. When the restaurant doors closed behind her, the echo of laughter and harsh words still rang in her ears. She took one last look inside, observing those people who couldn't imagine the pain and hunger she lived with. "One day I'll eat well. One day I'll get what I deserve," she thought. And with that, she went on her way. Ivy walked to the square across the street, her bare, dirty feet feeling the weight of the world. She sat down on the sidewalk, hugging her knees to her chest. The smell of soup lingered on her skin and clothes, now crusted and stiff from the spilled liquid. She tried to swallow her pain and tears, but they kept flowing. "Why can't people see beyond my clothes? Why am I invisible?" she murmured, watching the movement around her, the passers-by seeming oblivious to her presence. As she cried, the same little girl from the restaurant, the one who had asked her mother about Ivy, ran up to her, something hidden in her small hands. Glancing around cautiously, the girl offered Ivy a piece of bread. Ivy looked at the bread in surprise, her eyes lighting up with gratitude. "Here, I couldn't eat it." "I thought you might be hungry," the girl whispered, giving a shy smile and avoiding Ivy's gaze as if she were doing something forbidden. Thank you so much. I don't know what to say," Ivy replied, clutching the bread as though it were a precious treasure, feeling a warmth spread in her heart from this unexpected kindness. She was about to take a bite when she heard light footsteps and turned around. Surrounding her were other children, all as ragged and hungry as she was, their dirty faces and hollow eyes reflecting the same struggle she felt. They looked at her with hope and need, silently pleading. Ivy swallowed hard, hesitating. Then determined, she smiled. "We can share," she said, breaking the bread into small pieces and offering it to the others. "It's not much, but it's what we have, right?" she added, trying to mask her sadness with a smile and focus on the comfort those crumbs could bring. The children, their eyes glistening with gratitude, accepted the small pieces and ate slowly, savoring each crumb as though it were a feast. One younger girl hugged her tiny piece carefully before bringing it to her mouth. "Thank you, Ivy." "I don't remember the last time I ate bread," she whispered. Ivy smiled, though her heart felt heavy. Hunger is cruel, but we don't have to face it alone, she thought, finding peace in the solidarity of their shared meal. After eating, the children thanked her with shy smiles and returned to their familiar corners in the square, hiding among benches and trees. Just then, Ivy felt a light touch on her shoulder. She turned to see a man she didn't recognize, who with a gentle smile placed some coins into her hand without a word, then walked away. Ivy looked down at the coins in astonishment, her heart swelling with gratitude. She imagined what she could buy with them. Maybe I could even buy some more food for me and them, she thought, feeling a small spark of joy bloom amid her harsh reality. With newfound determination, Ivy decided to use the money to buy something she could share with the other children. She stood and walked towards the nearest stall, planning to get enough bread to give each child a piece. It'll be our feast for today, she thought, clutching the coins like a treasure. As she passed a pharmacy, she heard a rough voice that made her stop. Looking inside, she saw an elderly lady, frail and with trembling hands, struggling to count her coins at the counter. The clerk stood impatiently, arms crossed. "Ma'am, if you don't have the full amount, I can't sell it to you. This isn't a charity," he said with irritation. The lady desperately counted her coins again, but it wasn't enough. Ivy's chest tightened. She knew what it felt like to need help only to find doors closed. She looked at the coins in her hand, torn between buying food and helping the woman. She needs these coins more than I do, she decided, Taking a deep breath and making her choice, quietly Ivy approached the counter and placed her coins beside the elderly woman's. The woman looked at her in surprise, eyes wide and moist with gratitude. The clerk huffed but took the money, handing over the medicine. "Dear, you didn't have to," the woman stammered, her voice choked with emotion. Ivy shrugged, smiling as if it were nothing. "Everyone needs help, right? Today it was your turn. Tomorrow it could be mine." The woman held Ivy's hand and squeezed it, her gaze filled with deep gratitude. "You're an angel, my dear. A true angel," she whispered before leaving with her medicine. Ivy watched the woman disappear into the square, a peace settling over her heart that she hadn't felt in a long time. An angel? Who would have thought? "Maybe I'm just someone who still believes that kindness comes back around," she murmured, a soft smile gracing her lips. As she sat on the sidewalk, observing the people bustling by, her gaze fell on a familiar figure in the square. Sullivan, a well-known millionaire. He passed through every day at the same time, a symbol of power and wealth in their community. But today, something about him seemed different. His steps were slow, his shoulders slumped, and his face was weary, as though carrying a weight that even money couldn't relieve. Ivy watched him curiously, wondering what could possibly trouble someone who seemed to have everything. Sullivan stopped to speak with someone, his voice so low it was nearly a whisper, and then continued on his way, his expression vacant and his eyes distant. Ivy watched him closely, curiosity flickering in her gaze. How can someone with so much seem so empty, she wondered, reflecting that perhaps what he lacked was something money couldn't buy. Seated on the sidewalk, Ivy realized that despite her own hardships and humiliations, she still found comfort in small kindnesses, something that seemed foreign to Sullivan's life. He passed through the square every day, always in a hurry, always focused. But today he looked lost. Ivy sighed, wishing that somehow he could see there were other treasures in life beyond wealth. Maybe he also needs a little help, maybe even a little love, she thought as she watched him approach the street corner. Just as Ivy began to stand, the sudden roar of a speeding bus caught her attention. She looked towards Sullivan, who, distracted by his phone, was stepping into the street, oblivious to the oncoming danger. The bus was approaching too fast, and Sullivan, his eyes glued to his screen, walked on as though unaware of the world around him. Ivy's heart skipped a beat. He doesn't even realize what's happening. He's about to get run over. Adrenaline surged through her, and without a second thought, she started running towards him. With each step, Ivy felt the weight of responsibility, the distance between them seeming impossibly vast despite him being just meters away. "I need to get to him. I can't let him get hurt," she murmured, her eyes locked on Sullivan, who still remained oblivious to the danger. The bus driver honked, trying to alert him, but Sullivan didn't react, his head still bent towards his phone. With one last burst of strength, Ivy launched herself at Sullivan, pushing him out of the path of the oncoming bus and throwing him towards the sidewalk. He fell with a heavy thud, his eyes widening as he registered the gravity of what had just occurred. Ivy, however, couldn't avoid the bus's impact. The world seemed to spin as she was thrown to the side of the street, her small body colliding with the ground in a painful crash. For Sullivan, time seemed to stop as he watched Ivy lying there, shock etched across his face. Stumbling to his feet, he rushed to her side, his phone forgotten, left discarded on the street. "My God, what have you done? Little one, can you hear me?" he asked desperately, his voice trembling as he knelt beside her. Ivy's eyelids fluttered, her gaze unfocused, and he gently held her face in both hands, as if trying to anchor her to consciousness. "Stay with me. You can't leave me now. I need help. Someone, help!" Sullivan shouted, looking around wildly. Passers-by began to gather, some with shocked expressions, others whispering among themselves. A few called for emergency services, while others stood by, hesitant and unsure of what to do. Still crouched beside Ivy, Sullivan struggled to keep her eyes open, his voice filled with fear and regret. "Don't close your eyes. Look at me. You saved me. You can't leave me here now. I'll never be able to thank you enough," he murmured, his voice breaking. Ivy blinked, still conscious, though the exhaustion seemed to pull her towards a deep, encompassing darkness. She tried to focus on Sullivan's voice and managed a faint smile. I'm okay, just tired, she whispered, her voice barely audible, as if the words themselves didn't carry enough strength to comfort him. Ivy's vision blurred, Sullivan's face appearing as if seen through a mist. It became harder to keep her focus, her thoughts drifting, and her strength waning. Sullivan, seeing her slipping away, grew frantic. Don't do this to me, please. Stay with me. I don't know what to do. Someone is coming to help, he said, almost as if he were convincing himself as much as her, his voice laced with panic. You're strong, I know you are. Look at me, he pleaded, his voice cracking as fear overtook him. Ivy felt her head spinning, his words seeming to come from a faraway place. She tried to respond, but a heavy blanket of fatigue enveloped her. It's all right, she murmured, barely able to muster the strength to say anything else. Faces around her blended together in a blur as she let her eyes close for a moment, feeling an odd relief in finally resting. Sullivan's voice echoed faintly. Stay with me, please. She sensed the desperation in him, and it struck her how vulnerable, how human he seemed, something she had never imagined. Sullivan held her hand tightly, his own eyes brimming with tears as he looked around helplessly, each passing second intensifying his anguish. I don't know your name, but please, you can't leave me like this. You saved me, and I need you to stay so I can thank you, so I can help you somehow. His voice dropped to a whisper as he pleaded. People in the crowd tried to reassure him, saying an ambulance was on its way, but he seemed not to hear, trapped in his own torment, his entire focus on Ivy. Hold on, they'll be here soon. You'll be all right. You have to be, he repeated, as if the words were more a mantra for his own solace than for her. With a soft breath, Ivy managed, My name is Ivy, sir. Sullivan kept hold of her hand, refusing to let go, kneeling beside her even as the crowd around them grew and the faint sound of ambulance sirens began to fill the air. He tried to keep her awake, but Ivy's strength was slipping fast. She blinked, struggling against the overwhelming weariness that was pulling her under. You need to stay with me, little Ivy, he whispered desperately. Is there anything I can do for you? Anything you want me to do when you get better? I have to repay you for saving my life. Her eyes opened slowly, her face flushed, and his words resonated as a distant promise. She seemed to ponder the question, her voice barely a whisper, yet filled with a clarity that cut through the noise. What do I want? She murmured, as if reflecting on something profound, her voice fragile yet filled with purpose. Gathering what little strength she had left, she answered, I want you to feed the children in the square, so they don't go hungry. Her words struck Sullivan with the force of a revelation, and he froze. The children? In the square? You don't want anything for yourself? Only for me to give them food? He repeated, scarcely believing the simplicity and selflessness of her request. A lump formed in his throat, and for the first time tears began to stream freely down his face. He, a man who had always believed money could solve anything, now felt utterly powerless in the face of this small, fragile life slipping from his grasp. Yes, sir, so that they have a little more than I did, Ivy whispered, her gaze trying to hold on to his, though the weakness made it harder and harder to stay present. Sullivan, still holding her hand, brushed away his tears with his free hand, hoping she wouldn't see his despair. I will, I promise, he said, his voice breaking, but you have to stay with me. Hold on just a bit longer until the ambulance arrives. Understand? Tell me something you like, he added, trying to keep her awake, his voice trembling as he struggled to keep a steady tone. He needed to distract her, to keep her present, but the desperation seeped into every word. Ivy gave the faintest hint of a smile, her voice a soft whisper. The children, they need someone to take care of them, and I've done my part. Her words faded as she added, her voice faltered, trailing off as if she were saying goodbye. Sullivan clutched her hand, his heart aching as he watched the last glimmer of light in her eyes. Please, I beg you, give them food. Their stomachs hurt, Ivy implored, her weak voice carrying the weight of countless silent pleas. Sullivan clutched her hand tighter, his own desperation growing as he watched her slip further away. "No," he whispered fiercely, his voice choked with pain he hadn't known he could feel. "You haven't done everything yet. You need to help me understand. Please, stay with me. Stay conscious. Show me how," he begged, each word laden with a raw, piercing guilt. Taking deep breaths, he tried to maintain calm, shielding her from the panic he felt rising in his chest. Finally, the sound of the ambulance drew closer, and the paramedics rushed through the crowd, clearing a path to reach Ivy. Even as they knelt to examine her, Sullivan refused to let go of her hand. "She needs to get to the hospital as soon as possible," one paramedic warned, his tone grave. "Her condition is critical. She won't survive if we don't hurry." Sullivan's response was swift. "I'm going with you. I won't leave her alone," he said firmly, without a hint of hesitation, as if staying by her side was the only choice that mattered. He climbed into the ambulance beside Ivy, holding her hand tightly as the paramedics worked to stabilize her. Her face had gone pale, and her body lay still, unconscious now. He looked down at her, his heart heavy with an unfamiliar concern that had gripped him since the moment she saved his life. "Why did you do that? Why did you risk your own life? For me," he murmured, as though hoping for an answer, even if he knew she couldn't respond. But as if from a distant place, Ivy's faint voice stirred. I would do it for anyone, sir," she murmured, her words barely audible, yet somehow steady. "My mama used to say that the kindness we do is what we leave as a legacy in the world." Sullivan felt his chest tighten, a fresh wave of tears streaming down his face, unbidden. This small, fragile girl, with nothing but a heart full of kindness, had risked everything for him. The ambulance finally reached the hospital, but as Sullivan stepped out, carrying Ivy gently in his arms, he found himself shocked by the sight before him. It was a hospital for the underprivileged, worn down and understaffed. Lines of people, weary and desperate, filled the hallways as doctors and nurses rushed around, stretched too thin to attend to everyone in need. He took a trembling breath, his heart heavy with regret. "I should have come with my driver. I should have done this differently." The thought struck him, echoing with a newfound understanding of how little his daily comforts meant in the face of true hardship. His choice to walk alone that day, to feel a fleeting sense of independence, seemed so small now. All that mattered was saving Ivy. The doctor came to attend to them, but his weary expression revealed the challenges within the hospital. "Her condition is critical. We'll take her in immediately," he said, motioning for the nurses to place Ivy on a stretcher. Sullivan walked alongside her, his grip on her hand never loosening. In that moment, surrounded by the worn-down walls and harried staff, his panic deepened. "I'll pay for whatever is needed. Just save this girl. I don't care about the cost. Just tell me what needs to be done," he said, his words desperate, hoping that somehow his wealth would be enough to fix everything. The doctor paused, looking at Sullivan with a hint of pity before shaking his head. "Sir, this hospital is partially on strike. We're short on resources and staff. I'll do my best, but she's in a very fragile state, and we lack the proper equipment here," he explained, his voice steady but laced with resignation. Sullivan's face fell, his desperation mounting. "It can't be. Then transfer her somewhere else. I'll pay for the transport, the hospital, everything she needs. She needs care now," he insisted, his tone bordering on a command. Each word a plea masked as an order. The doctor studied him carefully before responding, his face serious and cautious. "I understand, sir, but in her current state, moving her is a significant risk. She may not survive the journey. Immediate care is critical, but here we're doing all we can within very limited means," he explained, his words landing like a heavy blow on Sullivan's heart. Sullivan looked at Ivy, her pale face a stark reminder of her fragility. "Then do what you can. For God's sake, don't let her go like this," he pleaded, his desperation evident in every syllable. Sullivan held her hand tightly as if his grip could somehow transmit strength, could somehow work a miracle. "Please, you can't leave me like this," he murmured softly. I was saved by this girl. I can't let her not survive because of me," he whispered, hoping in some part of himself that Ivy could somehow hear him. The doctor, his face showing the sorrow of one who knows the weight of inadequate resources, sighed before giving swift instructions to his team. They began adjusting equipment and administering medications, trying to stabilize Ivy as best they could. Just keep fighting, he said, his voice breaking as he felt the crushing guilt of helplessness. A few minutes later, the doctor returned, his face troubled but resolute. Mr. Sullivan, we're doing everything we can to stabilize her, but her vital signs are fluctuating. Her condition is so critical that the best chance would be immediate, specialized care, which we can only get with a transfer to a better-equipped hospital. But I must warn you, the risks of moving her are high. Sullivan felt a lump form in his throat, but he shook his head, determined. If we leave her here, she won't survive. That's it then. We're transferring her now to the best hospital in the city. I'll cover all the costs, take all the risks, but I can't leave her here without a fighting chance, he replied, his voice thick with both fear and regret. The doctor, understanding the urgency, nodded and quickly ordered the ambulance prepared for the transfer. Sullivan stayed beside Ivy, squeezing her hand as if he could somehow share his own strength with her. Please, Ivy, you've been strong up to now. Just hold on a little longer, he whispered, his eyes brimming as he watched the team carefully lift Ivy onto the stretcher. He climbed into the ambulance beside her, his gaze fixed on her serene face as the vehicle sped through the streets. You saved me, Ivy. Now I need to save you. Just hold on a little longer, he murmured, as if willing her to hear him. The paramedics worked swiftly to stabilize her, adjusting equipment to monitor her vitals, but Ivy seemed to grow paler with every passing minute. Sullivan's chest tightened as he held her hand, feeling the gravity of each moment. She's just a child, he thought. Just a child. How can life be so cruel? Finally, the ambulance arrived at the private hospital, and a team of doctors immediately took Ivy from the stretcher, rushing her to the emergency room. Sullivan followed, his mind a torrent of fear and regret. Do everything possible. I'll pay whatever it takes. Just save her, he pleaded with the doctors as they wheeled Ivy down the corridor. Sir, we'll do all we can, but her condition is very serious. We need to assess the full extent of her injuries right away, one of the doctors replied, as Sullivan watched Ivy disappear into an examination room, the distance between them growing until she was out of sight. Outside the room, Sullivan was left alone, feeling a profound sense of helplessness. He had never thought he'd find himself so desperate, so powerless, standing outside a hospital room, trapped between the need to do something and the inability to change what was happening within. She's so young. This shouldn't be happening, he murmured, his voice barely audible as he tried to hold himself together. He didn't know if he could bear losing someone who had done something so noble for him, a stranger. I'll honor your courage, Ivy. Just don't leave me now. After what felt like an eternity, a doctor finally emerged from the room, his expression somber. Mr. Sullivan, he said, we've discovered a severe internal hemorrhage. We need to operate immediately. If we don't stop the bleeding, she may not survive. Sullivan felt his heart drop, his voice quivering as he replied, Then do it. Spare nothing. I beg you. His words barely escaping the tightness in his throat. The doctor nodded and quickly returned to the operating room, leaving Sullivan in the hallway, the weight of uncertainty and fear pressing down on him. Each minute felt like a torment, every second a painful reminder of his inability to do anything but wait. He recalled every detail of that moment in the square, how Ivy's small, fragile smile had lit up her face as she asked him to help the children, her words filled with an awareness of her own vulnerability. Please hold on, he whispered, running a hand over his face, feeling the tears he could no longer contain. I promise, Ivy, I'll do everything you asked me to, but I need you alive to see it happen. Suddenly, the alarm sounded inside the operating room, and the doctors began to move quickly. Sullivan's heart raced as he tried to understand what was happening. A nurse rushed out and, seeing his expression, stopped for a moment. She went into cardiac arrest. We're trying to resuscitate her. Please keep hoping, she said quickly before going back inside. Sullivan brought his hands to his face, feeling the weight of helplessness and pain. She can't leave like this. She still has so much living to do. "Ivy, you have to fight, please," he whispered, trying to hold on to hope. The room's lights flickered, and Sullivan could see the frantic movement of the doctors trying to save Ivy's life. Each second felt like an eternity, and all he could think about was the promise she had made him make. "You saved me without expecting anything in return. I should have been more grateful. Please don't leave me. I promise to do what it takes to honor your generosity," he murmured, his eyes fixed on the door, desperately waiting for any sign that she would hold on. After a few minutes, the doctor came out, his face worried. "We managed to resuscitate her, but she lost a lot of blood. We need to monitor her internal organs as the impact was severe, especially on her kidneys. They're starting to fail, and we'll need to act quickly. Otherwise, she won't make it," the doctor explained, looking directly into Sullivan's eyes as if to prepare him for the worst. Sullivan nodded, feeling his body tremble. "Do whatever is necessary. I'll cover all the costs. Just don't tell me she has no more chances," he replied, his voice laden with fear and pleading. The tension in the ICU was palpable. Ivy was surrounded by machines and wires, each emitting a specific sound, marking her fragile life's rhythm. The heart monitor showed an unstable line with sudden spikes that worried the doctors and nurses around. The experienced team, accustomed to handling critical situations, now felt the weight of every second that passed without an improvement in her condition. The silence was broken only by the intermittent sound of the monitors and the doctor's rapid orders, while Ivy, motionless and pale, seemed to drift further away. The first sign of deterioration came when her heart rate began to increase irregularly, causing one of the doctors to frown and quickly approach. "She's tachycardic. We need to stabilize her before her heart goes into failure," he said, his voice laden with urgency. The nurses adjusted medications and exchanged worried glances, already anticipating what would come next. The line on the monitor oscillated relentlessly, and Ivy began to tremble slightly, her muscles contracting in spasms that intensified with every second. Suddenly, her body began to violently contort. The first seizure took hold of Ivy, and the doctors acted swiftly, trying to stabilize the situation. "Seizure! Adjust the medication dosage now," ordered the doctor, trying to maintain calm as he controlled the attack's progression. The team followed instructions, each movement calculated, but the situation slipped from their grasp as Ivy's body shook uncontrollably. The alarms on the machines went off simultaneously, a desperate symphony of sounds that made it clear how critical her condition was. The doctor quickly checked the monitor and made a grave expression upon seeing the fluctuation in her vital signs. "We need to act fast, or she'll go into shock," he said, his voice low, almost as if speaking to himself. The monitor indicated a sharp drop, and Ivy's face began to rapidly lose color. With each spasm, it seemed her body was battling between life and death, and the medical team was at their limit, without the time needed to act with the calm they desired. "Her heart rate is out of control. She's losing too much internal bleeding," one nurse warned, trying to contain her own tension. The team adjusted more medications, attempting to control the spasms and the dangerously fluctuating blood pressure, but each attempt seemed insufficient to stop the deterioration. Meanwhile, the chief physician did a quick check, and what he saw confirmed the worst. "Her kidneys are failing. She won't be able to process the medications with her renal function this compromised," he stated, exchanging a worried look with the team. One of the assistants checked the data and shook his head in despair. "If we don't contain this crisis, the kidney failure will accelerate. We don't have much time. She needs an urgent donation. She won't survive." "There's no time to look for a donor that fast," he murmured, adjusting the machines in hopes that Ivy would hold on. Sullivan, waiting outside, felt each alarm sounding like a blow to his chest. He kept his eyes fixed on the ICU door, his hands trembling as he tried to control himself. "Please, Ivy, you've been through so much. Just hold on a little longer," he muttered, his face marked by tension and the tears he tried to hold back. He knew that with every second that passed, Ivy's chances diminished. Inside the ICU, Ivy's condition worsened. The doctor in charge looked at the nurses and signaled that they needed to intervene directly on her kidneys to try to save the girl. "Start the procedure to stabilize renal function. We can't waste time," he ordered, his voice firm but tinged with desperation. The team moved around Ivy as if every second was crucial, adjusting the tubes and monitors while her body continued to show signs of weakness. The doctor felt the pressure of time and new options were running out. With her kidneys compromised, Ivy grew weaker, and her body couldn't maintain the balance of essential medications. "Prepare the emergency procedure," he ordered, and the nurses began connecting the machines. But even with all their attempts, the signs of kidney failure were clear, and he knew they needed an immediate response from her body for any chance of success. Suddenly, the heart monitor began showing an irregular line, and her blood pressure plummeted. "She's going into shock!" one of the nurses shouted, and the team acted quickly to try to stabilize Ivy's heart. Every second was vital, and they worked as if Ivy's life depended on the next move. "Let's keep her pressure stable. Do whatever you can," the doctor ordered, trying his best not to lose control of the situation. Sullivan heard the shouts and alarms from outside, panic growing more and more. He wanted to go in, to do something, but he knew any intervention could worsen her condition. He clasped his hands as if in silent prayer and repeated to himself, "Please, Ivy, you have to fight. I'm here, waiting for you. Please stay with me." Inside the ICU, the situation was desperate. The doctors worked tirelessly, but Ivy's body continued to show signs of multiple organ failure. "If we can't stabilize her now, she won't make it," the doctor commented, trying to maintain hope. They continued their stabilization attempts, but Ivy's frail body didn't respond to the stimuli as expected. Sullivan sat in the waiting area, his face pale and his eyes fixed on the door through which the doctor would enter. He tried to control his nervousness, his trembling hands resting on his knees. Every second seemed like an eternity. The heavy silence and cold air of the room only intensified the anguish he felt. "She's just a girl. She needs a chance," he murmured to himself, trying to remain steadfast. He knew that any news at that moment would be decisive for Ivy, and he was willing to do whatever was necessary. Finally, the doctor entered with a serious expression that made Sullivan's heart race even more. He pulled up a chair and sat facing Sullivan without beating around the bush. "Mr. Sullivan, we need to be direct. Ivy's situation is extremely critical. She will only survive if she receives a new kidney immediately. However, she needs this kidney urgently, and finding a compatible donor so quickly is nearly impossible." "I'm sorry, sir. We will do everything we can to find one, but the chances are almost completely unlikely," the doctor began, his voice heavy with the gravity of the situation. Sullivan felt his entire body freeze. The idea of losing Ivy was unbearable. I can donate. I'm healthy, and I can do this for her," he replied, his voice laden with determination and fear at the same time. The doctor hesitated, and Sullivan realized that something wasn't right. "Sir, the chance that you are compatible with the girl is almost impossible. You have no degree of kinship with her. We can test you, but it would be a miracle if you were compatible because the odds are against you. I know compatibility can be a problem, but you can take the test. If you prefer, I suggest that you say goodbye to Ivy," the doctor explained, trying to keep his tone firm. "Sir, I want to make it clear that we can do the test, but don't hold out too much hope that you'll be compatible. The chances are unlikely." Sullivan nodded impatiently and was soon ushered in for a battery of tests. Every second felt like torture as he waited for the results, his mind fixed on Ivy, teetering on that fragile line between life and death. "Please let everything be okay." "Let me be the answer," he whispered, hands clasped in supplication. When the doctor returned, Sullivan nearly leapt out of his chair, anxious to hear any news. The doctor, however, was visibly uncomfortable. He looked at Sullivan with a grave expression. "Mr. Sullivan, we don't have the compatibility results yet. However, your tests have revealed a condition that we need to discuss." He placed the papers on the table, pointing to some critical points. "You have a serious heart condition. Your heart is overworked, and if you undergo surgery to donate a kidney, there is a very high chance that you may not survive it," he finished carefully, but the message was clear and direct. Sullivan felt the ground open up beneath his feet. The doctor's words echoed in his mind, but he refused to accept them. But that can't be. I feel fine. I've always been healthy. I need to do this for her. I won't stand by if I can do something to help her." "Ivy saved my life," he replied, trying to convince himself that the doctor was wrong. But the doctor shook his head, confirming the diagnosis. Mr. Sullivan, you can't ignore the severity of the situation. This condition didn't appear out of nowhere. It has been developing over time, and with the current stress, it's rapidly worsening. If you have any stress spike, it could be fatal. Sullivan averted his gaze, feeling the weight of the news crushing his hopes. He took a deep breath, trying to process what he had just heard. But if we do nothing, she'll die. If I'm a match, I'm going to donate. I can't leave her like this, he murmured, eyes welling up, trying to find the strength to accept the devastating reality. The truth hit him with a crushing intensity. The dilemma between saving Ivy and risking his own life was a burden too heavy to bear. The doctor sighed, understanding the gravity of the situation but needing to be direct. If you insist on donating a kidney, the risk is extremely high. We're talking about a real chance that your heart won't withstand the procedure. This decision needs to be made with extreme caution, he explained, trying to be as clear as possible despite the weight of his words. Sullivan could hardly believe he was trapped in such a choice. But the image of Ivy, so fragile, was stronger than his fear of his own death. He leaned forward, holding his head in his hands. Taking a deep breath, he tried to calm his racing heart. I can't let her die. She needs me, and I'll risk whatever it takes for that. Tell me, do I have any chance at all? He asked, almost pleading. The doctor hesitated before answering. Mr. Sullivan, any exertion could worsen your condition. The chance exists, but it's minimal, and any distress could accelerate the strain on your heart. Besides, it's even more unlikely that you'll be compatible. Sullivan closed his eyes, feeling a sharp pang in his chest, but his desire to save Ivy was stronger than his fear. Then I want to try. I'll do it for her, even if it costs me my life, he whispered, his voice firm yet broken. The doctor still tried to convince him to reconsider, but Sullivan was resolute. I made a promise, and I can't break it. Ivy needs someone to protect her, and I'm the only person who can do that now. Suddenly, a nurse rushed in, interrupting the conversation. Sullivan knew immediately that something was wrong. Mr. Sullivan, it's Ivy. She's getting worse. She's not responding to the medication anymore, the nurse said, her face etched with concern. Sullivan's heart raced, and he felt a sharp pain in his chest, as if the world was crumbling around him. The doctor watched him with growing worry, realizing that Sullivan was beginning to react to the stress. Mr. Sullivan, please try to stay calm. You can't be alarmed like this. It's dangerous for your condition, the doctor warned, as Sullivan struggled to control his breathing. But the pain in his chest only worsened. The news of Ivy's decline had hit him like a blow, and he felt utterly helpless, unable to act to save the only person who had rekindled his belief in kindness. The doctor's words sounded distant as Sullivan fought to breathe, his chest tightening, his mind consumed by the image of Ivy, slipping further and further away. He could barely think, but with what little strength he had left, he tried to articulate a sentence. I can't leave her alone, he murmured before feeling his vision darken, overcome by the arrhythmia that finally caused him to lose consciousness. Sometime later, Sullivan slowly opened his eyes, the room spinning as he tried to focus on the pale light from the ceiling. He felt weak, as if something had ripped him from reality and thrown him back into it, lying there unable to react. Gradually, memories began to return. Ivy, the tests, the discovery of his own heart condition. He tried to get up, but a nurse by his side gently pressed a hand on his shoulder, indicating that he should remain lying down. Mr. Sullivan, please rest for a bit. We're still monitoring your condition, she said, her voice calm but firm. He took a deep breath, fighting the urge to get up immediately. How is she? Ivy? Did she make it? He murmured anxiously, feeling his chest tighten with uncertainty. The nurse hesitated, causing his heart to race even faster. Sir, she's hanging by a thread. Her condition is critical, she said, her voice low, almost a whisper. Sullivan closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the situation crushing him. How much longer can she hold on like this, he thought, struggling to remain calm, knowing how critical time was. Just then, the doctor entered the room with a look of urgency. Mr. Sullivan, I need to discuss something important with you, he began, approaching the bedside. Sullivan's eyes fixed on him, absorbing every word with desperate anxiety. We ran the test to check compatibility and, surprisingly to the entire team, you are compatible to donate the kidney, the doctor said, trying to maintain a calm tone. Sullivan breathed a sigh of relief, a spark of hope igniting within him. So that's it. I'll donate. Doctor, I said I'd do whatever it takes, he replied, his voice firm, as if nothing could dissuade him. The doctor observed him for a moment before continuing, his face serious. Sir, the situation is highly risky for you. I need you to fully understand this before making a decision. Sullivan shook his head impatiently. I understand the risks, doctor. I know it could cost me my life, but it's a price I'm willing to pay to save her, he said, trying to sit up but still too weak. The doctor sighed, knowing Sullivan wouldn't back down, but he tried once more to make him reconsider. The surgery is complex, and with your heart condition, there's a high probability your heart won't withstand the procedure. This is no small risk, Mr. Sullivan. We want you to understand the gravity of the decision you're about to make, he stated, holding Sullivan's gaze steadily. Sullivan clenched his fists, aware of the danger, but increasingly determined. I know what's at stake, doctor, but Ivy is dying. She's a child who needs a second chance, and I can't let her go without doing anything, he said, his voice nearly breaking under the weight of his words. As they spoke, an alarm sounded in the distance, and Sullivan's heart raced. A nurse rushed in, her expression tense. Mr. Sullivan, Ivy is having another cardiac arrest. We're trying to resuscitate her, but her condition is becoming increasingly critical, said the nurse, causing Sullivan's world to spin. He felt pressure building in his chest, his heart racing as if trying to keep up with the despair consuming him. She can't leave like this, he murmured, feeling the pain intensify. He closed his eyes, struggling to remain calm, but the fear was uncontrollable. The doctor noticed Sullivan's distress and placed a hand on his shoulder. Please, sir, don't make any sudden movements. I understand what you're feeling, but we need you to stabilize for the procedure. Breathe deeply, advised the doctor as Sullivan tried to control his breathing, his eyes still filled with desperate determination. Doctor, I'll sign whatever is necessary. There's no time. She needs that kidney, and I'm willing to do this. I won't forgive myself if I don't, he affirmed, taking the clipboard the doctor offered him with a trembling hand. Sullivan signed the document authorizing the surgery, his determination evident in every movement, even as weakness threatened to overtake him. I promised to save some kids, and this starts with Ivy. She's my responsibility now, he murmured, gripping the clipboard tightly before handing it back to the doctor. The doctor nodded, acknowledging that the decision had been made and there was no turning back. As Sullivan was prepared for surgery, he felt the pressure in his chest increasing, as if his heart was resisting his will. He felt weak, but the image of Ivy, frail and fighting for her life, was all he needed to keep going. Just a little longer, heart. I just need you to hold on until she's safe, he thought, trying to focus on his breathing. With the preparations advancing, Sullivan was taken to the operating room, where the team was rushing to adjust the equipment and prepare the surgical center. The doctor approached him as a nurse made the final preparations. Mr. Sullivan, there's still time to back out. This surgery is an extreme risk for you, the doctor said one last time, hoping he would reconsider. Sullivan looked him in the eye, unwavering. Doctor, understand. This isn't just a choice. I need to do this. It's the only way to keep my promise, he replied firmly. The doctor sighed but respected the decision, signaling for the team to begin. However, as soon as the final preparations were made, Sullivan felt an intense pain in his chest. The monitor next to him started beeping, and the medical team exchanged alarmed looks. Mr. Sullivan, stay calm. Breathe slowly. Your heart is showing signs of failure, warned the doctor, trying to control the situation. Sullivan gritted his teeth,